It was late November of 2012 when I drove up north to a hunting cabin I hadn't visited in almost 6 years. It was a small place tucked deep in the woods of northern Minnesota, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest gas station. The cabin had belonged to my uncle before he passed, and after he died, it just sat there, empty and used and slowly decaying into the trees around it. I had been meaning to go up there for years, partly to clean it up, partly to get away for a few days. I told myself it was just for hunting, but I think I needed to be alone. The road leading there was more like a rough dirt trail. My old truck groaned over every bump and dip. The trees were bare, the ground covered in wet brown leaves. The air was cold enough to bite through my gloves when I got out to move fallen branches off the road. It felt like I was the only person within 50 miles, which was both peaceful and unsettling. When I finally saw the cabin through the trees, a squat wooden structure with a rusted metal roof and darkened windows, it looked worse than I remembered. The front steps sagged, and the door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. I parked a few feet away and stood there for a while, listening. The woods were completely still except for the wind pushing through the pines, the kind of quiet that feels heavy. I pushed open the door, and it scraped against the floor before it gave way. Inside smelled like old wood, dust, and something faintly damp. A mouse scurried under the stove as soon as I stepped in. The old table was still there, my uncle's chair, the gun rack on the wall. Everything was covered in a thin film of dirt, and the fireplace was stuffed with dry ash. I spent the rest of the day cleaning and unpacking. I swept the floor, aired out the bedding, and stacked a small pile of firewood near the door. By sunset, the place felt halfway livable. I sat outside with a small fire going, eating canned chili and watching the tree line turn dark. The forest looked endless from where I sat. The air got colder by the minute, and I went back inside before the light was completely gone. That first night, I didn't sleep much. The cabin creaked and popped as the temperature dropped. I kept hearing faint noises outside. Snaps, crunches, the kind of sounds you tell yourself are just animals. Still, I lay there awake for hours, staring at the ceiling beams. Around 3 a.m., I heard something move across the porch. Slow, steady steps. I held my breath. The steps stopped right near the door, and then there was silence. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. After a minute or two, I told myself it was just the wind shifting a branch or maybe a raccoon. I eventually drifted off, but the thought of those steps stayed with me. The next morning was gray and quiet. I stepped outside and noticed boot prints in the dirt, right in front of the porch. Not my boots, these were wider, heavier, and went off toward the tree line. I stood there staring at them for a long time. I hadn't seen another vehicle the entire drive up, and there were no signs of anyone camping nearby. I tried to reason it out. Maybe an old hunter or hiker came through recently. Maybe the prints were old and the rain hadn't washed them out yet. I convinced myself of that, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there that night. I spent the next few hours setting traps and checking the small clearing for deer signs. There were plenty, tracks, scat, broken branches, so I figured I might get lucky the next morning. Around noon, the wind picked up hard, whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls. I started chopping more wood just to stay busy, but every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, movement deep between the trees. Whenever I looked, there was nothing. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in thick and low, and the woods got darker much faster than usual. I went inside to light the fire and cook a little food. The sound of the wind outside mixed with the occasional thud of a branch falling somewhere out in the forest. The air felt strange, tense. I tried to ignore it and focus on my meal. That night, I heard it again. The footsteps, this time slower, heavier, circling the cabin. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I sat up in bed, staring at the dark window, trying to listen past the crackle of the fire. The steps moved from one side of the cabin to the other. Then they stopped. I could almost feel someone standing right outside the wall, only a few feet away from me. I reached for my rifle near the bed and stayed perfectly still. After what felt like 10 minutes, I heard the faint crunch of leaves moving away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I walked around the cabin again. The prints were there, fresh, deep, and going in a half circle around the cabin. The tracks led toward the trees again, but about 20 yards in, they just stopped. I knelt down, tracing them with my glove, trying to see where they went. There was no direction change, no sign of a fall or turn. They just ended. It made no sense. I tried to push it out of my head and focus on hunting, but I couldn't. Every sound in the woods made me jump. Every snapping twig felt close. I decided I'd stay one more night and then head home early. As the day went on, the air got colder and the sky turned the color of steel. I packed most of my things, leaving just the essentials for the night. Around sunset, I noticed something strange. Deep in the woods across from the cabin, there was a faint glint of metal. I squinted through the trees and realized it looked like an old truck or maybe a hunting blind. I figured I'd go take a look. Maybe whoever had been walking around was staying there. The walk over took about 20 minutes. The ground was uneven and damp, covered with old leaves and rotting branches. When I got closer, I saw it wasn't a truck. It was an old, burnt-out pickup. The doors were missing, and the inside was filled with black ash. The metal frame was rusted to the point it almost blended into the forest. I stepped closer and saw something inside, a hunting jacket, torn and faded, hanging from the steering wheel. I recognized the pattern. It was the same brand and color my uncle used to wear. I froze. My uncle's truck had gone missing years ago, around the time he died. Everyone assumed it had been stolen or scrapped. But here it was, half buried in the woods less than half a mile from his cabin. The air felt heavier as I looked inside. The seat had been torn open, and something metallic caught the light. I reached in and found an old hunting knife, rusted but still sharp. The initials carved into the handle were my uncle's. I didn't know what to think. I turned to head back, and as I did, I saw movement behind the trees. Just a figure, tall, wearing dark clothes, standing still between two trunks. I blinked, and it was gone. I walked back fast, heart racing. By the time I reached the cabin, it was nearly dark. I locked the door, stoked the fire, and sat there trying to calm down. I didn't eat. I didn't even take off my boots. I just sat and listened. That night, the footsteps came again. But this time, they didn't stay outside. I heard the porch creak, the door rattle softly, and then nothing, just the fire popping. I stared at the handle, waiting for it to move. It never did. I sat there with the rifle across my lap until the sun started to come up. In the morning, I packed everything fast. When I stepped outside, the footprints were back. But now they led straight up to the door, and there was a single handprint on the window beside it. A real, greasy handprint. I didn't look around or follow the tracks. I threw my gear into the truck and drove off, watching the cabin get smaller in the rearview mirror. When I finally hit the main road, I pulled over and sat there, shaking. I thought about the burned truck, the footsteps, the handprint. I didn't know if someone had been living out there all this time, or if it was someone who knew my uncle or something else entirely. All I knew was that I was lucky I left when I did. I never went back to that cabin. I sold the land the next summer and didn't tell the buyer a thing. Some nights, though, when I'm driving through empty roads or walking through the woods, I still catch myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see boot prints in the dirt again, leading right back to me. It was late October of 2019 when I decided to rent a small cabin tucked away in the northern countryside of the United Kingdom, just outside of a quiet village called Braithwaite. I had been working long hours at a warehouse in Manchester, and my head felt full, heavy with the constant hum of machinery and people. I wanted somewhere isolated, a place where I could sit in silence, away from city noise and faces. The cabin I found online was old but solid, surrounded by miles of empty hills and damp woods. The pictures showed a narrow dirt path leading to it, a patch of grass out front, and a small stream running behind. It looked perfect for peace and quiet. The drive took nearly 6 hours, most of it through twisting back roads. By the time I reached the turnoff for the cabin, the sun had started to drop behind the trees. The sky had turned a dull orange, and everything around looked darker than it should have at that hour. The dirt road was rough, and my small car jolted every few meters. When I finally pulled up, I saw that the cabin looked even older than in the photos. The paint had peeled from the wooden walls, the windows were fogged, and the roof had moss creeping down the edges. But it felt private, exactly what I'd wanted. The air was cold when I stepped out. The smell of wet earth and wood smoke drifted through the trees, though I didn't see any nearby houses. The only sound was the wind brushing through dry leaves. Inside, the place smelled faintly of old timber and dust. It had one main room with a small fireplace, a single bed, a table, and a shelf stacked with yellowed books. The wooden floor creaked under my boots. There was a narrow hallway leading to a small kitchen and a bathroom. Everything looked clean enough, but it had that kind of old, forgotten feeling like no one had stayed there in years. That first night, I unpacked, made a simple dinner, and sat by the fire reading until the flames died low. The wind outside grew stronger, and the trees creaked. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch, slow ones, like someone walking across wet wood. But when I went to check, there was nothing, just the cold night and the smell of pine. I told myself it was probably a branch or an animal, locked the door, and went to bed. The next morning was gray and misty. The ground outside was soft and muddy. I spent the day hiking through the hills, taking photos, just breathing fresh air. When I came back in the late afternoon, I noticed something strange. There were faint footprints in the mud near the side of the cabin. They weren't mine. They were smaller, like a woman's, and looked recent, pressed deep, still sharp at the edges. They went from the edge of the woods straight toward the cabin, stopping at the side window. I stood there for a minute staring at them. I checked the window, but it was locked from inside. There were no other marks, no sign of forced entry. I tried to shake it off, told myself maybe a hiker had come close to the cabin and turned back. Still, the thought stuck in my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep properly. The wind was howling, and the old cabin made small cracking noises in the dark. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first, but then I noticed something, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint but steady, like a low tapping from outside. Came from near the back wall behind the bed. I lay still, listening. It went on for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped. I waited another minute before sitting up and turning on the small lamp beside the bed. I didn't look out the window. I couldn't bring myself to. When I woke up in the morning, there were smudges on the glass. They looked like fingerprints, streaked slightly downward as if someone had pressed their hand against the window and dragged it slowly. My stomach tightened when I saw it. I cleaned it off, trying to convince myself that it could have been condensation or maybe I'd brushed against it myself. But I hadn't. I knew I hadn't. By the third night, the unease had sunk deep into me. Every sound made me alert. The rustle of trees, the groan of the wooden beams, even the ticking of the small clock on the shelf. It was just past 10 when I went to bed. But I didn't fall asleep easily. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling that tightness in my chest again. Sometime past midnight, I heard it, the sound of footsteps in the gravel outside. Soft, slow steps, crunching lightly, moving from the front toward the side of the cabin. My whole body froze. The steps stopped right outside the window. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. The seconds felt long and heavy. I could hear the faintest breathing, like someone standing right outside, close to the glass. Then came the faint scrape of fingernails against it. Just a single drag. I wanted to get up, but my limbs wouldn't move. I lay there for what felt like an hour until everything went silent again. I didn't look outside until morning. When daylight came, I finally got up the nerve to check. There were marks again, this time clearer. 5 long streaks down the glass, thin and precise. And more footprints in the mud, the same size as before, but this time circling the cabin. I followed them a few meters into the trees before losing them. My heart was pounding the entire time. I decided to pack my things that morning and leave the next day. I paid for the week, but I didn't care anymore. That evening, I tried to calm myself by lighting a fire and sitting close to it. I poured a drink and watched the flames, the warmth making me feel slightly better. Around 11, I heard something again, not from outside this time, but from the small hallway leading to the kitchen. A faint creak, like a floorboard under pressure. I stared at the dark opening, the firelight flickering across the wooden walls. My pulse kicked hard. I grabbed the small flashlight I kept near the chair and aimed it toward the hallway. Nothing, just still air and the faint smell of old smoke. I stood up, walked slowly, and checked every corner. The doors were locked, windows shut. I came back, heart still racing, and stayed up till morning without closing my eyes. When I went outside after sunrise, I saw her. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks, but she was there, standing at the edge of the woods, half hidden by the trees. A woman. Her clothes looked dirty, torn maybe. Her hair was dark, tangled, and hung over her face. She wasn't moving. She was just standing there, staring toward the cabin. I stood frozen on the porch, unable to think. The morning air was cold enough that my breath came out in small clouds. She didn't move for almost a minute. Then, without warning, she turned and walked slowly back into the trees until she disappeared. I didn't go back inside right away. I just stood there, numb, trying to make sense of it. She looked real, solid, human, but something about her face didn't sit right. It wasn't ghostly or anything like that, just wrong in a human way. Her skin looked pale, and her eyes seemed empty, distant. I packed everything that morning and left before noon. As I loaded the car, I kept glancing toward the tree line. The woman never came back into view, but I couldn't shake the feeling she was still out there, watching. When I got back to Manchester, I couldn't stop thinking about her. A week later, curiosity got the better of me, and I searched online for anything about that area. I found an old news article from 2011 about a missing woman last seen hiking near Braithwaite. Her car was found abandoned a few miles from where the cabin stood. They never found her body. Locals had searched the hills for weeks. The photo in the article made my stomach drop. It was her. Same dark hair, same hollow eyes. I didn't go back to that cabin again. I didn't even finish reading the article. I closed the laptop and sat still for a long time. The memory of her figure standing at the edge of those woods burned into my head. Maybe she was real, maybe she wasn't, but the footprints, the scratches, the breathing, all of it happened. And sometimes, when the night gets quiet and the wind starts moving through the trees outside my window, I swear I can hear that same slow tapping again, like she's still out there somewhere, walking in circles around a cabin that no one should have ever stayed in. It was late October, 1998, when I decided to take a few days off work and drive out to a small, forgotten corner of northern Pennsylvania. I had found an old listing in the classifieds about a hunting cabin for rent, sitting right beside an overgrown cemetery that dated back to the 1800s. The ad mentioned it was isolated, cheap, and quiet, exactly what I was looking for. I'd been tired of the noise of the city, tired of people, and just wanted silence for a few nights. The idea of being near a graveyard didn't bother me much. The dead didn't scare me. The living did. Or at least that's what I believed back then. The road leading there was a narrow, cracked strip of asphalt that eventually turned into a dirt track cutting through thick woods. My old Ford rattled over rocks and roots as I drove deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser the farther I went, their bare branches crossing over the road like twisted arms. The late afternoon light filtered through them in broken orange streaks. I remember passing an old metal sign on a leaning post. The paint had faded so badly I could only make out the word cemetery. The cabin came into view a few minutes later. It looked small, made of dark timber that had gone gray with time. The windows were covered with mesh wire, and the roof sagged in one corner. There was a single wooden step leading to the porch, and from there you could see the graveyard behind it. Just rows of crooked stones sticking up from the ground like old teeth. Some were cracked in half, others tilted or almost buried under weeds. A rusted iron gate surrounded it, with part of the fence broken near the far side. Inside the cabin, it smelled of wood, dust, and something faintly damp. There was a small table, a cot pushed against the wall, and an old stove in the corner. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering slightly when I turned on the power. I unpacked what little I'd brought: canned food, a flashlight, some tools, a few blankets, and set them on the table. The silence around the place was deep, almost heavy. No cars, no people, not even the sound of birds. Just whined through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. As it got darker, I stepped outside to look around. The air was cold and sharp, the sky a deep purple fading into black. The cemetery was only about 50 feet from the porch. The gravestones were scattered unevenly across a slope that led into the woods. Some of them had old metal crosses planted beside them. Others were barely legible. I remember kneeling beside one stone near the fence and brushing away the moss just to see the name. Elias Brower, 1879 to 1913. It struck me how long ago that was, and how forgotten the place felt. That first night, I built a small fire outside the cabin. I sat by it, listening to the wood crackle. The forest around me was so quiet it made every small sound feel louder. Every twig snap, every gust of wind moving through dry leaves. I tried to ignore the unease that came with it, telling myself it was just nerves from being alone. I turned in early, but sleep didn't come easy. I kept waking up to tiny noises, creaks, faint scraping sounds, maybe branches against the cabin walls. Once, I thought I heard something metallic, like the sound of the cemetery gate shifting, but I told myself it was the wind. The next morning was cold and gray. I went out to the graveyard with my coffee and noticed something odd. The dirt near one of the newer-looking graves, if you could call anything there new, seemed disturbed. The ground was uneven, as if someone had stepped there recently. I crouched down, touching the soil, and felt how soft it was compared to the rest. It didn't make sense. The place looked untouched for years, but that patch looked fresh. I figured maybe it was an animal, maybe raccoons or foxes digging around. I spent the day cutting some fallen branches for firewood, exploring a bit of the nearby forest. There were no houses, no signs of other people, just endless trees and an old path leading down a hill that vanished into thick brush. The silence started getting under my skin more than I wanted to admit. Even in daylight, the place had a strange stillness. That evening, I noticed more disturbed dirt, this time near another grave, closer to the center. It looked like claw marks, or maybe someone had been scraping the ground with a tool. I didn't see any footprints, though, just small indentations in the soil, deep and narrow, like something heavy had been dragged. I tried to shake it off, but it made me uneasy enough to check the door twice that night before sleeping. Around midnight, I woke up to a dull sound, something thumping softly outside. Not fast, but steady, like someone hitting wood with a slow rhythm. It was faint, coming from the direction of the cemetery. I sat there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening. Then it stopped. For a long minute, there was nothing, just the wind outside. I finally grabbed my flashlight, hesitated at the door, and decided against going out. I sat on the cot until morning light crept through the window cracks. When I stepped outside that morning, I saw something that made my stomach twist. One of the graves, the same one I'd noticed before, had a deep trench at the foot of it, like someone had dug partway into it overnight. The dirt was piled to one side, and there were marks of something being dragged toward the trees. I followed the disturbed trail for about 10 feet before it disappeared into dead leaves. I stood there a long time trying to reason it out. Maybe kids had come out here, though I hadn't seen a single sign of people. Maybe animals again, but it didn't look like any animal I knew of. That night, I barely slept. I kept the lantern on, listening to every sound. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, that slow, heavy thumping. This time closer. It sounded like something hitting the side of the cabin. Once, twice, then silence. I held the flashlight tight in my hand, waiting. I could hear the wind outside, faint scratching sounds, and then nothing. The silence after that felt worse than the noise. When morning came, I found smears of dirt on the cabin wall near the back, long streaks running down from the window frame. There were no clear prints, just clumps of soil stuck to the wood. I decided I'd had enough. I packed my things quickly, but when I went to start the truck, it wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead. I tried again and again, nothing. I remember sitting in the driver's seat, my hands shaking slightly, staring out at the cemetery through the windshield. I waited until noon, hoping someone might drive by, but nobody did. The dirt road was empty. Finally, I grabbed my bag, locked the cabin, and started walking the road out on foot. It was about 8 miles back to the nearest town. I didn't look behind me much, but once I did, just before the road curved away, and I swear I saw movement near the broken part of the cemetery fence. Something low to the ground, crawling, dragging itself slowly toward the trees. I stood there, frozen, watching until it was gone. I made it back to town just before sunset, covered in dirt and sweat. The mechanic I found the next day said my truck's battery had been drained completely, as if something had kept the lights on all night, but I knew I hadn't touched them. I didn't tell him where I'd stayed. I didn't tell anyone much of anything. Weeks later, I looked up that place again out of curiosity. The cabin wasn't listed anymore. I found an old article from 1975 mentioning the graveyard. Apparently, it had been abandoned after a small church nearby burned down. Some graves had never been marked properly, and locals said the area was used for unofficial burials for a while after that. I stopped reading halfway through. I never went back, and I still think about that night sometimes. The sound against the cabin, the disturbed earth, the dragging marks. I tell myself it was probably animals or the ground shifting, or maybe my mind playing tricks from being alone too long. But when I remember how that dirt looked fresh every morning, like it had been worked by hand, I can't shake the feeling that something or someone was trying to get out, not in. It was late September, 1997, when I decided to drive up into the hills of northern Montana just to get away from the noise of town. I'd been working at a repair shop in Billings for months without a real break, and I was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. I wanted silence, the kind of silence that sits heavy around you. I'd heard about a few cabins scattered deep in the woods, most of them built decades ago by trappers or miners and long since abandoned. It sounded perfect to me. The drive took almost 5 hours. The farther I went, the thinner the road became. Pave turned to gravel, and gravel turned to a dirt track that twisted through thick pine woods. The trees leaned inward as if they were trying to hide the road from anyone passing through. I had a single map folded on the seat beside me and an old green backpack stuffed with a flashlight, a sleeping bag, and some canned food. By the time I found the cabin, the sun was starting to fall behind the trees. It wasn't even marked on my map. I'd been planning to camp near a lake, but when I saw the roofline through the trees, dark wood, tilted, half collapsed on one side, I decided I'd sleep there instead. It was maybe 40 feet from the dirt track, hidden behind a thick wall of spruce. I parked the truck and climbed out. The air was colder than I expected, sharp with the smell of pine and something faintly metallic, like rust. The cabin looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The door hung crookedly off its hinges, and one of the windows was completely shattered. The steps leading to the porch were soft under my boots. I pushed the door open, and it gave off a long groan. Inside, the air was stale and heavy. Dust floated in the sunlight that came through the holes in the roof. The floor was warped, and the walls were stained dark from years of leaks. There was an old iron stove in the corner, a table with one leg missing, and a pile of yellowed newspapers on the floor. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't rot exactly, it was something older, like damp wood and animal fur and maybe old blood. I told myself it was probably raccoons or some animal that had nested there. I opened my backpack, set my sleeping bag down on a dry spot, and decided to walk around a bit before it got dark. Behind the cabin was a narrow path that looked like it had been made long ago by wagon wheels. It led down a slope into thicker woods. I followed it for maybe 100 yards before it just stopped, ending at a drop where the ground had eroded away. Down below, through the trees, I could see what looked like another structure. Maybe a shed or an outhouse, completely swallowed by vines. I didn't go down. The ground was soft and slippery, and I didn't want to risk twisting my ankle out there alone. When I got back to the cabin, the air inside felt different. Colder, stiller. I thought maybe the sun had gone behind the trees, but the temperature had dropped too quickly for that. I unrolled my sleeping bag and sat down on the floor. The silence was so deep that I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Every little sound, cracking wood, wind brushing through the holes in the walls, made me turn my head. I tried to eat one of the cans I'd brought, but I wasn't really hungry. I just sat there watching the doorway. The forest outside had gone from green to black in minutes. I turned on my flashlight and set it beside me, its weak beam trembling on the far wall. Around 9 or 10, I heard something outside. It wasn't the sound of a branch falling or an animal moving through brush. It was slower, heavier. I froze, listening. Whatever it was, it stepped once, then stopped, then stepped again. It circled the cabin slowly, the sound crunching through leaves, then pausing, then moving again. I sat there with my hand on the flashlight, trying to convince myself it was a deer. But deer don't move like that. They don't stop and start like they're listening back. I didn't move. The sound came up the porch steps. Each board creaked under weight. I held my breath, waiting for a knock, a hand, something, but it didn't come. The noise stopped right by the door. Then I heard it. A short exhale, almost human, just a single breath through the crack in the wood. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat upright with the flashlight aimed at the door until my batteries began to dim. Every so often, I heard faint movement outside again, circling, then going quiet. By morning, the ground outside was covered in dew. I stepped out slowly, scanning the dirt. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Not boot prints, not bare feet exactly, but something in between. Long, narrow, uneven. The toes dug deep like whoever or whatever it was had been barefoot but heavier than a man. They circled the cabin once and disappeared into the trees. I should have left right then, but I told myself it was probably some hiker or local who'd been messing around. Maybe they'd seen my truck and gotten curious. I packed my things, but before I could load the truck, I noticed something else. Marks on the cabin door. Long scratches running down the wood, deep and uneven, like they'd been made with a knife or a piece of metal. The drive out felt longer than the drive in. Every shadow looked like it was watching. The trees seemed to close tighter around the road. When I finally hit the gravel road again, I realized I'd been gripping the steering wheel so hard my fingers were stiff. Halfway down the mountain, I saw something on the side of the road. A piece of torn fabric caught in a bush. I slowed down and recognized it as part of a flannel shirt, faded red and brown, ripped along the seams. There were dark stains near the collar, brownish black like old blood. I didn't stop. I just kept driving until the woods fell away and the sky opened up again. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about that cabin. I told myself I'd just been paranoid, that someone had been camping nearby or maybe a bear had wandered close. But a few days later, I couldn't help it. I looked up that area on an old map at the library. The cabin wasn't marked, but I found something else. There used to be a small logging camp in those hills, active until 1973. One of the notes in the local records said the camp was shut down after a string of disappearances that were never explained. I didn't believe in stories like that. I still don't, at least not the supernatural kind. But I can't explain the prints or the breath I heard through the door. I can't explain why, even now, when I close my eyes, I can still picture that door and the way those scratches cut through the grain like something desperate had dragged them there. I haven't gone back since. I sold the truck a year later and started working nights just to keep myself busy. But sometimes, when the air outside turns cold and the wind hits the windows a certain way, I swear I can smell that same damp, metallic scent from the cabin, the one that clung to my clothes long after I left. I know I wasn't imagining everything. Something was out there that night, something real, something that moved slow and breathed heavy and waited until dark to come close. Maybe it was a man, maybe not, but whatever it was, it knew I was there. It had been watching long before I heard it move. And that's the part that still keeps me awake, knowing I wasn't alone in that place and never hearing it leave. It was late October, 1997, somewhere deep in the hills of northern Oregon. I had taken some time off work to get away from the noise of everything. Traffic, phones, people. I wanted quiet, something that felt raw and untouched. I'd always liked the idea of building something of my own, even if it was small, even if it was temporary. So I packed my truck with supplies. Plywood sheets, a few 2x4s, nails, a hammer, some tools, a tarp, and enough food to last a few days, and drove out into the woods where no one ever went unless they were lost. It had rained most of the day, the kind of slow, steady rain that soaks into your clothes no matter how many layers you wear. The dirt roads had turned to mud, and every turn of the tire threw wet earth up against the truck's sides. The forest on both sides looked endless, gray and dark under the heavy clouds. When I finally found a clearing near a narrow stream, I decided that was it. That would be where I'd build the cabin, or at least start it. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, more like the air itself was holding its breath. The rain tapping on the leaves above was the only sound, and even that came and went as the wind shifted. I set up a small tarp to cover my tools and started working. The ground was wet and uneven, so I had to dig shallow trenches for the floor posts, using flat stones to level them. My gloves were soaked within the first hour, and the cold bit through my fingers until they hurt. Still, I kept going. I wasn't about to drive all that way to sit inside the truck and do nothing. By evening, the light had faded fast. The sky turned from silver to a flat, colorless gray, then darker. The rain picked up again, heavier this time, loud enough that I could barely hear the sound of my own breathing. I decided to stop working when I realized I couldn't see the lines I was cutting. My flashlight beam barely made it through the mist. I threw a tarp over the half-built frame and went to sit in the truck. The inside smelled like damp clothes and wet metal. I ate a cold can of beans and listened to the rain pounding on the roof. The wind outside had started howling through the trees, a long, uneven kind of sound that seemed to shift from one side of the clearing to the other. Every so often, I thought I heard something else under it, like the snap of a branch or a thud in the distance, but I told myself it was just the rain breaking off limbs. It happens all the time in storms like that. Around midnight, I couldn't sleep. The rain had gotten worse. I could feel the truck shaking slightly whenever a strong gust hit it. The sound of branches scratching against the side made me think maybe parking that close to the trees wasn't smart. I turned on the flashlight and shined it through the windshield. The beam caught the rain like static, tiny white streaks cutting through the dark. I couldn't see much beyond a few feet. Everything looked like it was moving, the trees swaying, the rain shifting, and it made it hard to tell what was what. I stayed up for a while, staring at that half-built frame of the cabin. It looked strange in the dark, all angles and shadows. It didn't even look like something I'd built, just some abandoned shape left behind by someone who quit halfway. The wind was blowing the tarp off one corner, and I thought about going out to fix it, but I didn't. I just couldn't bring myself to step back out into that mess. By morning, the rain was still falling. The ground had turned to thick mud. I could barely walk without slipping. The air smelled like wet pine and dirt, heavy and cold. I got back to work anyway. I added more boards, built the walls up waist-high, and nailed down a rough frame for the roof. My hands were blistered by noon. The rain never stopped. Every sound seemed amplified, the hammer against wood, the water running off the roof edge, even my own breathing. Around late afternoon, I noticed footprints near the stream. They weren't mine. These ones were larger, deeper, spaced wide apart like whoever made them was in a hurry. They led from the edge of the trees to the stream and disappeared where the mud turned into water. I looked around, scanning the tree line, but there was nothing, just rain. I stood there for a while trying to figure it out. Maybe a hiker? Maybe a hunter? But there were no tire tracks, no sign of anyone else driving up there. That evening, I started a small fire inside the cabin frame. It wasn't much of a cabin yet. No door, no windows, just a skeleton of wood with a tarp roof. But it was enough to keep me out of the wind. The smoke drifted unevenly, stinging my eyes. The rain outside still fell hard, drumming on the tarp. I sat beside the fire and stared out through one of the open gaps where a window would go. Something about the forest looked different that night. It wasn't just dark. It was the kind of black that seemed to press in from all sides. My flashlight barely reached the first row of trees. Every now and then I thought I saw movement. Something small, low to the ground, slipping between the trunks. But whenever I focused, there was nothing, just branches swaying. I told myself it was animals, maybe deer or raccoons. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing out there, just watching. Later, when I went to grab some firewood from the pile near the truck, I noticed the footprints again. Fresh ones. Same size, same direction, leading from the trees toward the cabin. They stopped a few feet from the door frame. There were no prints leading away. I stood there, soaked, staring down at them. My heartbeat felt loud in my ears. The mud was thick, and the edges of the prints were sharp, like they'd been made recently. I looked around, sweeping the flashlight slowly across the clearing, but there was nothing, just rain hitting the leaves. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire until it burned down to coals. Every little sound outside made me tighten up. The crack of a branch, the dripping of water. Once, I thought I heard something dragging across the mud, slow and wet. I waited for it to come closer, but it never did. The night felt endless. By dawn, the rain had finally stopped. The air was still heavy with fog. I went out to check the tracks again, and they were mostly filled in with water, but I could still see where they'd been. I walked toward the trees, following the faint prints until they disappeared into the undergrowth. A few feet in, I found something lying half buried in the mud. A torn piece of fabric, maybe from a jacket. It was old, frayed at the edges, soaked through. The weirdest part was that there were no other signs, no broken branches, no footprints beyond that point. It was like whoever had been there just vanished into the woods. I finished the cabin that afternoon. I worked fast, just wanting to be done. The sun came out for the first time in days, breaking through the clouds. Steam rose from the wet ground. The air smelled cleaner, lighter. I put the last board up, nailed it in place, and stood back to look at what I'd made. It wasn't perfect, crooked in spots, rough edges everywhere, but it was mine. I stayed one more night just to see it through. No rain this time. The forest was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet as before. Felt empty, like something had moved on. The wind carried the smell of damp wood and ash from the fire. I sat inside the cabin, looking at the walls I'd built with my own hands, and felt a strange mix of pride and unease. In the morning, I packed up and left. The tire tracks filled slowly with water as I drove away. I kept looking in the rearview mirror until the cabin disappeared behind the trees. A month later, I went back, mostly to see if the rain had ruined it. The road was worse this time, covered in fallen branches and mud. When I finally reached the clearing, the cabin was still there, but someone had been inside. The door I'd built was cracked open, and the footprints, those same wide, deep ones, were all over the ground again. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, rain starting to fall again. I never went back after that. I left the cabin to whoever or whatever needed it more than I did. It was late October of 1996 when I decided to spend a few days alone at my uncle's old farm cabin in southern Iowa. He had passed away earlier that year, and the place had been sitting empty ever since. I had taken some time off work, and I thought a few quiet days away from people would clear my head. The farm sat about 7 miles off the main road, hidden behind a stretch of cornfields that hadn't been cut for the season. I borrowed my father's truck, packed a few groceries, some tools, and an old sleeping bag, and made the trip down in the afternoon. The road to the cabin was rough, gravel washed out by rain, patches of mud that clung to the tires. The air had that dry, cold smell of autumn when the fields start to die. I remember passing a few rusted mailboxes on the way, names half worn off by time, the farms around them long abandoned. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, sitting like a pale orange coin behind the trees. The cabin itself looked smaller than I remembered, wood darkened by years of weather, the porch tilted slightly to one side, a few boards missing from the steps. The surrounding land was quiet, too quiet. No sounds of tractors, no cows, not even the faint hum of insects, just wind. I parked the truck beside the barn, which was falling apart more than the cabin. Its roof had caved in near the back, and the smell of old hay and damp would hit me as soon as I stepped out. The grass around the place had grown high, brushing against my legs as I made my way up to the porch. The front door stuck a little when I tried to open it, and when it finally gave, the smell of stale air poured out. Inside, everything was coated in dust, the table, the counter, even the small wood stove in the corner. A stack of yellowed newspapers sat near the door, dates from early that year. It felt strange stepping into a place where someone used to live and knowing they never would again. I spent the first hour cleaning, brushing cobwebs off the windows, and opening the back door to let the air move through. The floor creaked under my boots, and somewhere in the walls, I could hear faint scratching mice, probably. There was no electricity anymore, so I had brought a few lanterns and some candles. By the time I got settled, the light outside had turned gray and cold. I cooked a can of beans over the small camping stove and ate while sitting on the porch steps. The sky was wide and empty, the horizon swallowed in the slow roll of fog that came up from the fields. The silence made me uneasy, but I told myself that was just the isolation getting to me. That night was rough. The temperature dropped faster than I expected, and the cabin's small fireplace barely held a flame. I slept in my clothes, wrapped in the sleeping bag, listening to the wind move through the cracks in the boards. Around midnight, I woke to a noise, something scraping against the outside wall. It wasn't steady, just one long drag, like metal on wood. I held my breath and listened, my ears straining in the dark. Then it stopped. I told myself it was probably a branch from one of the dead trees leaning too close, maybe pushed by the wind. Still, it took a while before I could fall back asleep. The next morning was gray and cold. The fog was so thick I couldn't see past the fence. I walked around the cabin to check the walls. Sure enough, near the back, a long scrape ran along the boards, deep enough to strip the paint. But there were no trees close enough to have caused it. I tried to reason with myself it could have been done years ago. I went to the barn to grab some firewood and noticed fresh footprints in the mud behind it. They weren't mine. These were smaller, lighter, and looked recent. I stared at them for a long time, trying to judge how old they were, but the moisture made it impossible to tell. I told myself they could have been from a hiker or maybe a hunter passing through. But the prints led around the back of the barn and disappeared into the high grass. That unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. The second night, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was nearby. I'd left the lantern on for a while, but the shadows it threw across the room made me more uneasy, so I turned it off and let the darkness settle. Around 2 a.m., I woke again to sounds outside. This time it wasn't scraping. It was soft, irregular footsteps moving through the grass, close to the porch. They'd stop, then start again. My heartbeat felt like it was shaking the bed. I stayed still, barely breathing, my eyes fixed on the faint outline of the window. The steps circled the cabin once, slow and deliberate. Then they stopped. I didn't move until dawn. When the light finally came, I went outside. The grass near the porch was flattened, like someone had been standing there for a while. A few feet from the steps, I found a set of prints again. Bare feet this time, pressed deep into the mud. They were adult-sized, but the toes were strange, almost spread wider than normal, like the person had been walking barefoot for a long time. My stomach twisted. I followed them a little way into the field until they vanished among the wet stalks of corn. I couldn't bring myself to go further. I went back, packed some of my things into the truck, and told myself I'd leave after one more night. It felt foolish to be scared of footprints, but my nerves were stretched thin. That evening, I decided to stay inside, lock the doors, and keep the lanterns burning. I tried reading one of the old magazines lying around but couldn't focus. Every sound outside made me jump. The creak of the windmill, the shifting boards, even the distant bark of what might have been a coyote. Around midnight, I heard something again. Not outside this time, inside. It was faint at first, like a floorboard giving way under weight. I froze, staring into the dark corners of the room. The lantern flickered, throwing quick flashes of shadow across the walls. Another creak, this one closer, from the direction of the kitchen. I didn't move. My hand was on the handle of the small hatchet I'd brought, gripping it so tight my fingers hurt. I waited, listening. The sound came again, slow and heavy. I thought about running out, but the idea of stepping into the blackness outside felt worse. Then the noise stopped, Silence filled the room so completely I could hear the ticking of my own heartbeat in my ears. After what felt like hours, I must have fallen asleep sitting up, because the next thing I knew, pale morning light was coming through the window. I stood, every joint stiff, and checked the house. Nothing was moved, no windows open. But near the back door, just inside the threshold, I saw it mud, a faint, smeared footprint that matched the ones from outside. I didn't eat breakfast that morning. I threw my gear into the truck, not caring how neatly it packed. The air outside was damp, the fog still sitting low over the fields. I took one last look at the cabin before I left. Something about the open windows, the slanted porch, the silence. It all felt wrong now, like the place had been watching me the whole time. I started the truck, the tires spinning a bit in the wet dirt before catching traction. As I drove down that long road back to the highway, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. The cabin grew smaller until it disappeared completely into the fog. When I reached town, I stopped at the gas station to fill up. The attendant mentioned that place, said no one had lived out there since my uncle died. And before that, a few locals claimed to have seen strangers wandering near the property at night, especially during hunting season. They'd vanish before anyone got close. He said the sheriff had gone out there a few times but never found anyone. I didn't tell him what I'd seen or what I thought I'd heard. There was nothing to prove it anyway. But even now, years later, I still think about those footprints, the bare ones pressed into the mud outside that cabin. I can still see their shape clear as day in my mind. Someone had been there, someone who'd been living, walking, and watching in those fields long before I arrived. And when I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still there, standing just beyond the fog, waiting for the next person who decided to spend a quiet night alone at the old farm. It was late October of 2016 when I decided to take a few days off work and spend some quiet time at a cabin I had rented deep in the woods of northern Michigan. I was 32 at the time, working in construction, and my days were loud and tiring. I wanted silence. I wanted to get away from people, cars, and the constant noise of the city. I had rented cabins before, but this one was different. It wasn't the usual vacation spot by a lake or near a trail. It was tucked far inside the forest, down a dirt road that looked barely used. The drive there took almost an hour off the main highway. The GPS signal cut off halfway, and I had to rely on printed directions the owner had emailed me. The trees grew thicker and closer to the road as I went deeper. My truck's tires kicked up loose gravel, and there were no signs of any other houses, no mailboxes, no power lines. When I finally saw the small clearing with the cabin, I felt both relief and a strange unease. It was quiet, too quiet. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. The walls were made of dark, rough timber, and there was a small porch with 2 chairs that looked like they hadn't been used in years. I could smell damp wood and old pine needles. Inside, it was simple. A single bedroom, a small kitchen, a living area with an old wood stove, and a bathroom in the back. There was no cell service and no Wi-Fi. The owner had left a note saying the power sometimes went out during storms, and that there were candles and a flashlight in the drawer. That first night was calm. I made some canned soup on the stove, wrote a few notes in my small journal, and stepped outside before bed. The air was cold, and the forest was dark in a way city people don't understand, thick, heavy darkness that swallows everything beyond a few steps from the porch light. The stars were bright, and there was a faint rustling sound far off, probably an animal moving through the leaves. I didn't think much of it and went back inside. The second day started normal. I took a walk down the narrow dirt path that ran behind the cabin, just to explore, curved around the hill and went deep into the woods. After about a mile, I found a clearing with an old rusted truck, half sunk into the ground, covered in moss. There were beer cans scattered nearby and a torn blue tarp hanging from a tree. I figured someone had used it for camping years ago. The place looked abandoned, but there were signs of recent movement, like someone had walked there not long ago. The leaves near the truck were disturbed, and there was a footprint in the mud, not fresh, but not old either. I crouched down and studied it. It was large, maybe from a boot. I assumed a hunter had passed through recently. That night, I couldn't shake off a strange feeling. The woods seemed louder. Every small sound stood out. The cracking branches, the wind brushing against the windows, the shifting noises from outside. Around midnight, while lying in bed, I heard something faint. It wasn't an animal sound. It was slow, deliberate movement, the kind that made you picture someone stepping carefully on dry leaves. I held still, listening. After a few minutes, it stopped. I told myself it was nothing and eventually fell asleep. On the third day, I woke up early, before sunrise. The cabin was cold, and when I looked out the window, I noticed something odd near the edge of the clearing. The leaves looked disturbed again, like something or someone had walked around during the night. I went outside, my boots crunching softly against the frost. There were faint tracks leading from the tree line toward the cabin, stopping a few feet away from the porch. The shape of them looked like boots. My first thought was that a hunter had wandered close by mistake, but the direction didn't make sense. Whoever it was had come straight toward the cabin, stopped near the porch, then turned back into the woods. I spent most of that day inside. I read an old magazine I found on the shelf and tried to ignore the uneasy feeling that kept building up in my stomach. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that being alone in the woods always made people jumpy. But that night, it got worse. Around 11 p.m., the power went out. The lights flickered once, then everything went dark. The sound of the forest seemed to get louder instantly. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer, its weak beam cutting through the cabin's interior. The wind had picked up, and the trees outside groaned and shifted. I checked the breaker box, but everything seemed fine. It was probably the storm. I lit one of the candles and placed it on the table. Not long after, I heard it again, the same careful movement outside. Slow, steady, like footsteps circling the cabin. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I turned off the flashlight, thinking maybe if I stayed quiet, whoever or whatever it was would move on. The sound stopped for a moment, and the silence was so complete that I could hear the creaking of the wood stove. Then came a new sound, something brushing against the wall outside, dragging along the side of the cabin. I sat there for a long time, holding my breath, until it finally stopped. I didn't move until morning. When daylight came, I went outside. The ground was covered in wet leaves from the night rain, but near the wall of the cabin, I could see the marks. Scratches in the wood, long and uneven, as if someone had run a stick or metal tool across it. There were also footprints again, clearer this time, leading from the woods to the cabin and back. I counted 3 sets. That was when I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly and loaded the truck. As I was closing the back door, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On the side of the cabin, just near the window where I had been sitting the night before, was a small piece of fabric caught on a nail, dark brown like part of a jacket. I took it off the nail and held it. It was damp, but not from rain. It smelled faintly of sweat and something else I couldn't place. The drive out felt endless. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees. When I finally got back onto the main road, I pulled over at a gas station. The attendant looked at me like I'd just seen a ghost. I didn't tell him what happened, just filled up and drove straight home. Later that week, curiosity got the better of me. I searched online for anything about that area, trying to see if maybe there had been reports of trespassers or hunters around. I found an old local forum post from a few years earlier. People had written about strange things in that part of the forest. Campsites found trashed, hikers hearing movement at night, even missing gear from cabins. Someone mentioned an old man who used to live deep in those woods, a hermit who disappeared after his place burned down sometime around 2003. Others said a few squatters had taken over some of the abandoned structures later on. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't ghosts or anything like that. But that somehow made it worse. Someone had been out there, watching, maybe even trying to come closer. I never went back to that cabin. A few months later, I checked the rental listing out of curiosity. It had been taken down. The owner stopped replying to emails. Maybe they sold it. Maybe they realized it wasn't a place anyone should stay alone. Even now, almost 10 years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and think I hear that same slow movement outside my window. The sound of someone carefully stepping through the leaves, just far enough away that I can't see them, but close enough that I know they're there. It was late October of 2013 when I decided to take a few days off from work and drive up to my uncle's old hunting cabin in northern Minnesota. The place sat deep in the woods near Miller Ridge, about a half-hour drive from the nearest gas station. I was 32 then, tired of the noise and rush of the city, and I wanted quiet. The cabin wasn't much, just a single-room log structure with a small kitchen, a rusted metal stove, and a porch that leaned slightly forward as if the whole thing was tired of standing. My uncle had used it years ago for deer hunting. He passed away in 2007, and the cabin had been sitting there ever since. Nobody in the family cared much for it anymore. The roof leaked in a few places, and mice had chewed holes in the old pantry boxes, but I didn't mind. I packed my dog, a German Shepherd named Boone, some canned food, a hatchet, a flashlight, and my old Remington rifle just in case there were bears nosing around. I figured I'd spend 3 nights there. No phone service, no internet, just quiet. By the time I got there, it was already late afternoon. The drive had been long. The narrow dirt road nearly washed out in spots from the rain earlier that week. The trees were bare, their black branches twisting up into a gray sky. Everything smelled like damp earth and pine. Boone jumped out of the truck as soon as I opened the door, running around, sniffing the ground, tail wagging. I unlocked the cabin with the old key I'd found in a kitchen drawer back home. The door groaned open, and the smell of stale wood and dust hit me hard. There were still old beer bottles on the counter from my uncle's last trip, a tin coffee pot blackened from use, and a pile of chopped firewood stacked neatly beside the stove. I swept the floor, aired the place out a little, and started a small fire to dry the air. The first night was quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears. I sat by the window for a long time, watching the light fade through the trees. The sky turned from pale gray to dark blue, then black. Boone curled up near the stove, half asleep but still alert, his ears twitching every time a twig snapped outside. I slept lightly, waking up a few times to the wind creaking through the rafters. The second day, I spent the morning hiking down to the small stream that ran about half a mile behind the ridge. I brought a small bucket, filled it with water, and cleaned it through the filter I'd brought. The ground was soft from the rain, and I saw fresh tracks in the mud. Deer, raccoon, and something heavier, maybe a black bear. The prints led uphill, toward the thick pines behind the cabin. I didn't think much of it. By evening, clouds rolled in again, and the wind picked up. It wasn't a strong storm, but the air felt heavy. I cooked beans and rice on the stove, fed Boone, and sat out on the porch for a while with a flashlight and a small notebook. Around 9 p.m., I heard something moving through the trees. It wasn't the wind. It was a slow, dragging kind of sound, like something heavy being pulled along the ground. Boone's head shot up. His ears went straight and he started a low growl. I turned off the flashlight, trying to listen. The sound stopped. Then it came again, closer this time, maybe 50 yards out. I felt that strange tightness in my chest that comes when your brain knows something's wrong before you can explain why. I stayed still, watching the dark between the trees. Boone was staring in the same direction, his fur raised. I thought maybe it was a deer caught in something, or a bear rummaging through fallen branches. After a few minutes, the noise faded away. I went inside, locked the door, and kept the rifle close by the bed. That night, I barely slept. Every small sound, the wind, the tapping of branches against the window, Boone shifting his weight, had me wide awake. Around 2 in the morning, Boone growled again. Not loud, but deep, rumbling from his throat. I didn't move, just listened. I could hear it again. Footsteps outside, slow, crunching over the gravel near the porch. My heart started racing. I reached for the rifle, steadying it across my lap. The footsteps moved toward the window. I could hear them clearly now, heavy boots grinding against the dirt. Boone's growl grew louder, his teeth showing in the dim firelight. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. I held my breath. Then there was a sound, a faint scrape of metal against wood. The doorknob turned once, slowly. It didn't open. The latch held. Whoever it was must have realized it was locked, because after a few seconds, the sound stopped. For a long minute, nothing happened. Then the footsteps backed away, fading into the dark. I didn't move until dawn. When light finally came through the windows, I opened the door and looked outside. There were boot prints on the porch, fresh ones. Not mine. They came from the woods, stopped at the door, then turned back the same way. The prints were deep, heavier than mine, like the person had been carrying something. I checked the edge of the tree line. About 30 feet out, I found something that made my stomach tighten. A black plastic tarp, half buried under wet leaves, torn open at the corner. Inside, I saw what looked like a stained jacket and part of a rope. I didn't touch it. I just stood there, staring, feeling that creeping sense of dread crawl up the back of my neck. I went back inside, locked the door again, and decided I'd leave the next morning. That day dragged on forever. I packed my things, keeping the rifle close. Boone wouldn't stop pacing, his ears flicking toward the woods. Around sunset, I noticed something new. My truck, parked about 20 yards away, had fresh mud splattered up the sides. I hadn't driven it since I arrived. When I looked closer, I saw that the driver's door wasn't fully closed. I knew I'd shut it. I always did. I checked inside. The glove box was open, papers scattered across the seat. My phone charger, which I'd left there, was gone. Whoever had been here last night had come back. Maybe while I was down by the stream earlier. The thought made my hands shake. I went back inside, nailed a few boards across the door just in case, and stayed up the entire night, listening. I didn't hear footsteps that time, but around 3 a.m., I saw something through the window, a flashlight beam, far off between the trees, moving slowly toward the cabin. The light disappeared for a few seconds, then came back again. It was about 200 feet out. I turned off the lantern and sat in the dark with Boone pressed against my leg, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The light moved back and forth for a while, like whoever was holding it was searching for something. Then it went out completely. I waited another hour before I even stood up. By morning, I was done. I loaded the truck as fast as I could, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. The forest was quiet again, almost too quiet. On my way down the trail, I stopped at the ranger station near the highway. The man there was older, maybe in his 60s. I told him someone had been wandering around the Miller Ridge area, possibly breaking into cabins. He frowned and said a few places had been vandalized earlier that month, mostly old hunting sites. He said a few rangers had found remains of a camp a few miles north, a spot where someone had been living out in the woods for a while. He mentioned they'd found something worse too, just a few days earlier. a shallow grave near the ridgeline, a hiker gone missing 3 weeks ago. I drove home that afternoon, never looking back once. I didn't say anything to anyone else about what I'd seen, the boot prints, the tarp, the flashlight. I figured the rangers would find what they needed eventually, but I've never gone back to that cabin. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I think about that night, about the sound of footsteps outside the door. I keep wondering what would have happened if I hadn't locked it, or if I'd stepped out onto the porch when I first heard the noise. That cabin still stands up there, I'm sure, buried in the trees, leaning a little more each year. But whatever was walking around out there in the dark, whatever was dragging that tarp through the leaves, I don't ever want to find out who it was. It was late October of 2017 when I decided to take a short break from everything and head out to my uncle's old hunting cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. I had been working long weeks at the factory, barely sleeping, barely eating properly, and I felt like I just needed a few quiet days away from the noise. I brought my dog, Rocco, with me. He was a big German Shepherd mix, loyal, calm, and always alert. I trusted him more than most people. The plan was simple: stay 3 nights, rest, clear my head, and come back before Monday. The road to the cabin was narrow and rough, a single-lane dirt path that looked more like an old logging trail than a road. Trees crowded close on both sides, and the branches scratched lightly against my truck as I drove. The air felt colder than it had in town, sharp and damp, like it was warning me of an early winter. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was already low, the light dimming fast through the trees. The cabin was old but sturdy. It sat a few hundred feet off a small lake, surrounded by tall pine and birch. It hadn't been used in a while. I could tell from the thick layer of pine needles and leaves covering the porch and the faint smell of mold that hung inside. The air was stale, but after opening a few windows and lighting a small fire in the stove, it started to feel livable. Rocco sniffed every corner, pacing back and forth, his nails clicking against the wooden floor. He didn't seem nervous, just curious. That made me feel better. He always sensed things before I did. The first night was uneventful. I sat near the fire with a flashlight and an old paperback book, the sound of the wind moving through the trees outside. Rocco lay by the door, his head resting on his paws. The silence was thick out there. No cars, no people, just the occasional snap of branches or the distant call of an owl. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of every little noise your own body makes. When I went to bed that night, I left the lantern burning low, just for comfort. Rocco slept beside the bed. The wind picked up around midnight, and a light rain started tapping against the roof. I fell asleep to that sound, calm and steady. The next day, I spent mostly outside. I chopped some wood, fixed the screen door, and took Rocco for a long walk around the lake. The water was still, dark, and cold-looking, reflecting the gray sky above. There were no other cabins nearby, no sign of people, just the wilderness stretching out in every direction. At one point, I noticed tracks along the shore. They looked like deer prints at first, but there was something odd about them. They were deeper on one side, uneven, like something limping. Rocco stopped and sniffed the ground, his ears up, his tail stiff. I figured it was just an old injury on a deer or maybe a coyote dragging a leg. Either way, we moved on. That evening, it rained again, harder this time. I stayed inside, cooked a can of soup on the stove, and watched the firelight flicker across the walls. The wind howled through the cracks around the windows, and I could hear the trees groaning under the weight of the storm. Around 10, Rocco lifted his head suddenly and stared toward the front door. His body went tense, every muscle alert. I froze and listened. There was a sound, faint, distant, but real. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't the wind. It was a dull, slow thump, like something heavy hitting the ground outside. I turned off the lantern, leaving just the glow from the fire, and listened again. Another thump, then another closer. I waited, barely breathing. Rocco stood up now, moving toward the door, his hackles raised. My heart started pounding. The sound moved around the side of the cabin, heavy, uneven footsteps in the wet ground. They stopped near the back window. I felt my stomach tighten. The thought of someone out here, in the middle of nowhere, in the pouring rain, didn't sit right with me. I grabbed my flashlight and the old hunting knife I kept on the counter. I didn't open the door. I just stood there, waiting, listening. Minutes passed, then silence. Only the rain against the roof. Rocco didn't relax. He stood there, staring at the door, growling low in his throat. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak in the cabin made me jump. When I did finally drift off, it was light outside. In the morning, I checked around the cabin. The ground was soft and muddy from the rain, perfect for tracks. I found them easily. Large boot prints going from the woods right up to the side of the cabin, circling around it once, and then heading back into the trees. They were deep, spaced wide apart, like whoever made them was big and carrying weight. I followed them for a while until they disappeared into the thick brush. I didn't like that. I wasn't supposed to see anyone out here. My uncle used to say this place was 50 miles from the nearest main road. I went back inside and double-checked the doors and windows. Everything was locked. That whole day, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on small things. Collecting dry wood, fixing a loose shingle, brushing Rocco. But it stayed in the back of my head. Even Rocco seemed restless. He kept pacing near the windows, sniffing at the air. That night, I set a lantern on the table and stayed up late. The rain had stopped, but the air was colder now. I could hear the faint sound of the lake moving, small waves against the shore. It must have been past midnight when Rocco started growling again. Low, deep, steady. I got up and turned off the lantern. The moonlight came through the window just enough for me to see the edge of the porch. That's when I noticed movement. Something standing just beyond the tree line. It wasn't close enough for me to see clearly, just a dark shape against the lighter background of the forest. It stood still, facing the cabin. My chest tightened. My first thought was that it was a man, maybe the same one from before. My second thought was that I didn't know what kind of man would just stand there watching someone's cabin in the middle of the night. Rocco barked then, sharp and loud, breaking the silence. The shape moved fast, back into the trees, disappearing like it had melted into the darkness. I stayed at the window for a long time after that, but it didn't come back. The first light, I packed my things. I wasn't going to stay another night. I loaded up the truck, made sure everything was locked up, and started the engine. Before pulling away, I walked around the cabin one last time, just to see if there were any new tracks. There were, fresh ones. This time they came closer, right up to the back steps where the mud was still soft. The prints were big, the heel worn down. I counted at least 10 of them. The thing that got me was how they stopped right there at the steps, facing the door. Whoever it was had stood there for a while, just watching, probably listening too. As I drove down the dirt road, I glanced in the mirror. The cabin got smaller and smaller until it disappeared behind the trees. I didn't stop again until I hit the main highway. Only then did I realize how tense I'd been. My shoulders aching, my hands gripping the wheel too tight. Rocco was quiet the whole ride, his head resting on the seat beside me, eyes open and alert. I never went back to that cabin after that trip. I told my uncle what happened, and he didn't seem surprised. He just said sometimes people wandered through those woods, hunters, squatters, or men who didn't want to be found. Maybe that's all it was. But I still think about those prints, about how close they came to the door, about how long they might have been standing there before I even woke up. Even now, years later, when it rains at night and the wind presses against the windows, I can almost hear that slow, heavy sound outside again. The sound of boots in wet dirt, moving closer, stopping just beyond the wall. Rocco's gone now, but sometimes when I sit in the quiet, I swear I can still feel the way his body tensed beside me that night, warning me before I even understood what was out there. It was October of 2019 when I decided to take a few days off work and drive up to a small cabin I'd rented in northern Arizona. I'd been working long hours in a warehouse in Phoenix, and my mind felt fried. I needed quiet, real quiet, the kind that you only get when you're far from cities, highways, and people. I'd found the cabin listing online. It looked plain, old, but clean. The owner said it sat near the edge of a national forest, about 30 miles from the nearest town. That sounded perfect to me. I packed up my truck with some food, a sleeping bag, a few tools, and an old rifle I kept for safety. The drive took nearly 6 hours. The deeper I went into the woods, the more narrow and uneven the roads got. My phone signal disappeared about halfway in. The last few miles were just a dirt trail, barely wide enough for my truck. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked smaller than I'd imagined. Just a single floor with a slanted tin roof and faded wooden panels. There was a stack of chopped wood out front and a small porch that creaked when I stepped on it. Inside, the place was simple: one main room with a bed, a small kitchen area, and a fireplace. Everything smelled like dust and old pine. I opened the windows to air it out, then went for a walk around the area before sunset. The forest felt heavier than usual. The air was colder than it should have been for October. I remember the silence most of all. No wind, no insects, no birds. Just the sound of my boots on dry leaves. That first night, I made a small fire inside the cabin and sat by it for a long time, listening to the wood crackle. I didn't have any cell signal, so I just stared at the flames and tried to clear my head. Around midnight, I heard something outside, faint, but clear. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, dragging steps circling the cabin. I turned off my lantern and just listened. The steps paused every few seconds, then moved again. I tried to tell myself it was a deer or maybe a coyote, but something about the rhythm didn't sound right. It was too heavy, too deliberate. After a few minutes, it stopped. I waited a while before checking the window, but I didn't see anything out there. Just blackness and the faint outline of the trees. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I went outside to check for prints. The ground was soft from rain a few days earlier. I saw tracks around the cabin, but they didn't look like animal prints. They looked human, barefoot, with long, thin toes pressed deep into the mud. I crouched down and studied them. The stride was strange, uneven, like someone walking with a limp. The size wasn't small either, maybe a man's foot, but longer than average. I told myself it was probably some local who wandered around drunk or hunting, maybe lost. Still, the sight of those tracks bothered me the rest of the day. I spent the afternoon chopping wood and keeping myself busy. As the sun went down, I lit the fireplace again, this time keeping the rifle beside my chair. That night, I heard it again. The same dragging steps, this time closer. They came from the woods, stopped by the porch, and then circled to the back of the cabin. I didn't move. I could hear breathing outside one of the back windows. Slow, heavy, like someone standing still but watching. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. The breathing lasted maybe a minute, then faded away. I didn't sleep. I sat up until sunrise with the rifle in my hands. When morning came, I stepped outside, shaking from exhaustion. There were more prints. They circled the cabin completely, and some led off into the trees. I followed them for about 50 yards before they disappeared near a shallow creek. The weird part was that one of the prints looked smudged, like whoever made it had stopped and crouched down. The mud there was disturbed, like a knee had pressed into it, but too sharp, too narrow. I thought about leaving that day, but something in me wanted to understand what was happening. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe stubbornness. I told myself I'd stay one more night. Around dusk, I stacked more wood by the fire and locked the doors. The forest outside looked endless and dark. I didn't want to go near the windows anymore, so I sat with my back against the wall, facing the door. Sometime after midnight, the noises started again, but different this time. It wasn't just footsteps. I heard a low sound, something between a cough and a groan, coming from outside the front door. It sounded close, too close, like someone was standing right on the other side of the wall. Then, the footsteps moved around to the back, and I heard something brush against the siding, slow, scraping sounds, like fingers dragging on wood. I held my breath. The fire had burned low, and the shadows in the cabin seemed to grow longer, reaching toward me. The scraping stopped. Then I heard a thump on the roof, something light at first, then heavier, like someone crawling across it. I pointed my rifle upward, not knowing what else to do. The noise stopped, and for a long time, there was only silence again. I sat like that until the first light crept through the window. When I finally stepped outside, I saw new prints on the porch and something else. On the wooden rail, there were faint streaks of reddish-brown, like blood. A few strands of coarse, dark hair were stuck to the wood. I felt sick looking at it. I walked around the cabin slowly, scanning the tree line. I didn't see anything. I packed my things right then and there. I didn't care about the rest of my food or the supplies I'd brought. I just wanted out. The drive back down that dirt road felt endless. My hands were shaking on the wheel the whole way. A few miles before hitting the paved highway, I saw something on the side of the road. A deer carcass, or at least what was left of one. The body was torn open, ribs showing, but what made me stop was the way the legs had been arranged. They weren't scattered. They were lined up neatly, side by side, like someone had placed them there. I didn't stay to look longer. I drove straight to the nearest gas station, went inside, and sat for a while just to be around people again. My clothes smelled like smoke and pine and something else. A faint, sour odor I couldn't identify. When I finally got back home, I couldn't stop thinking about the sound I'd heard that second night. The breathing, the dragging steps, the way the prints circled the cabin. I told myself it had to be a person, maybe some local living off the grid, someone not right in the head. But there was something about the size of those prints and the shape of that hair that didn't fit. 2 weeks later, I looked up reports from that area. Nothing about missing people, no attacks, nothing strange. Just forest, old cabins, and silence. Sometimes, late at night, when everything's quiet, I still think about that place. I can almost hear that slow, uneven walk outside my window, circling, stopping, listening. I never went back. I sold the rifle, stopped camping, and moved to an apartment in the city. I told myself it was safer that way, surrounded by lights, traffic, and people who would hear if something came scratching at the walls again. But every now and then, I wake up in the dark, heart pounding, and swear I can smell that same faint odor of wet pine and blood. Like something old and patient is still out there, waiting in the trees, listening, remembering me. It was late September of 1998 when I drove out to my grandmother's old cabin in northern Montana. The place had been empty for years since she passed, and the rest of the family had decided to sell it. They wanted me to go up there, clear out what was left inside, and make sure the property was ready for inspection before the sale. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, maybe 12 or 13, and I barely remembered much except for the smell of pine and the sound of the creek that ran behind the cabin. I brought my dog, a black and tan shepherd mix named Rex, thinking it'd be good to have company out there. I didn't like the idea of being completely alone in the woods. The road that led to the cabin was rough and narrow, cutting through thick forest that looked untouched for years. The air was cold and dry, and the further I drove, the less I saw of anything man-made. No phone service, no signs, no cars. Just trees, silence, and the occasional crow perched on a fence post. It was mid-afternoon when I finally saw the clearing and the old structure sitting there. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, almost sinking into the ground, with patches of moss covering the roof and one of the windows cracked. The front steps sagged under my boots when I walked up. The key still worked, though it took a bit of force to turn. When the door creaked open, the air that came out felt stale, heavy with dust and the faint smell of old wood and something else. Something sour, faintly metallic, like wet iron. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the smell of rodents or mold that had built up over the years. Inside, everything was covered in a thin gray film. The furniture was exactly where it used to be. The rocking chair in the corner, the small dining table near the window, and my grandmother's old oil lamp on the counter. The walls were lined with family photos, faded and curled at the edges. I left the door open to let some air in, then set my bag down near the couch. Rex wandered around, sniffing everything like he was trying to piece together a story from the smells. The first few hours were uneventful. I swept the floors, packed up old dishes, and sorted through drawers full of yellowed papers and photographs. The sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long orange shadows through the windows. By the time it got dark, I'd lit a couple of candles since the power was out. I sat down for a while, listening to the quiet, except for the wind brushing through the trees outside and Rex pacing near the front door. Later that night, I decided to check the small shed behind the cabin. My grandmother used to keep tools and gardening supplies in there. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, showing thick weeds covering most of the path. The shed door was jammed, and it took a few hard pulls before it opened. Inside, everything was covered in cobwebs. Rusted tools hung from hooks, and broken crates sat in one corner. But then there was a smell, sharp and foul, the kind that stings your nose and settles in your throat. It was stronger than what I'd smelled inside the cabin. Rex started growling low, his ears pinned back, staring at a tarp in the back corner of the shed. I hesitated, the beam of my flashlight shaking a little as I walked closer. The tarp was old, stained, and half buried under a pile of rotting wood. I pushed some of the debris aside, and the smell hit me full force, thick, sour, and unmistakable. I pulled back the corner of the tarp, and there it was, a body, or what was left of one. It didn't look recent. The skin was leathery and grayish, stretched tight in some places and missing in others. The clothing was torn, but I could see what looked like an old flannel shirt and jeans. The boots were still on, one of them half sunk into the dirt. The sight froze me in place. For a long moment, all I could do was stare. My first thought was that it might have been a hunter or a drifter who'd gone missing years ago. Maybe he'd come across the cabin, died of exposure or something. But the way the tarp was wrapped around him didn't look accidental. Someone had put him there. I backed out slowly, dragging Rex with me, my stomach twisting. I wanted to leave right then, drive straight back to town, but it was already late, and the road was pitch black with no streetlights. I decided to wait until morning and call the sheriff as soon as I got a signal. I locked the cabin door, shut the windows, and sat on the couch with my flashlight on my lap, staring at the floor. I didn't sleep much. Every sound outside made my heart race. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. Rex stayed alert all night, occasionally lifting his head and staring toward the door like he heard something I couldn't. When daylight finally came, I stepped outside, half expecting to find footprints or signs that someone had been there, but everything looked exactly the same. The forest was quiet, still, I took one last look at the shed before loading my things into the truck. The body was still there, the tarp slightly shifted from the wind. I made sure not to touch anything else. The drive back felt longer than before. The air inside the truck still carried a hint of that smell, stuck in my clothes and in my head. When I finally got into town, I went straight to the sheriff's office. I explained everything, down to the exact spot where I found the tarp. They followed me back out there later that day. When they removed the tarp, the sheriff's face changed. He didn't say anything at first, just turned to one of the deputies and whispered something under his breath. Then he looked at me and asked if I remembered anyone who used to help around the cabin years ago. Handymen, neighbors, workers. I told him about a man named Dennis who used to come by sometimes, a drifter who did odd jobs for cash. My grandmother always let him stay in the shed when the weather got bad. The sheriff nodded, looking down at the remains again. They found an old wallet in the back pocket of the jeans. The ID was barely readable, but the name was Dennis Harper. He must have been there all these years, buried under that tarp behind her cabin. They said the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. Judging by how deep he was buried under the debris, it was clear he didn't just fall or die accidentally. The investigation stretched on for months, but nothing ever came of it. There were no suspects, no records of anyone seeing Dennis after 1985, the same year my grandmother stopped visiting town. She'd been quiet about her past, never talked about her younger years, and when she died, we didn't ask questions. When they finally cleared the property, I went back one last time before the sale. The cabin was empty, stripped of everything, just wood and dust and the faint smell of pine again. I stood by the window looking out toward the trees, and for a second, I imagined my grandmother standing in the yard years ago, waving goodbye like she used to. But I couldn't shake the thought that she'd lived out here all those years with that body buried just a few feet away. Hidden under a tarp she must have placed herself. Maybe it was self-defense, maybe something worse, no one would ever know now. Before I left, I locked the door one last time and stood on the porch, looking out at the shed. The air was still, no sound but the wind moving through the pines. Rex sat beside me, his ears perked, eyes fixed on the same direction. That night, when I finally got home, I burned the clothes I'd worn and threw out the boots I had on at the cabin. The smell never seemed to leave me completely. Every once in a while, when the air is still and cold like it was that week, I catch that faint, sour scent of wet iron again, and it pulls me right back to that shed behind my grandmother's cabin, where the truth had been buried for more than a decade. Even now, years later, I don't think about that place without picturing the tarp, the faded flannel shirt, and the quiet way the forest kept its secret all those years. It was late October of 2016 when I decided to spend a few days alone at an old cabin deep in northern Montana. I had rented it from a man online who claimed it was a perfect spot for anyone who wanted quiet and isolation. At that time, that was exactly what I was looking for. I just left my job in Billings and needed time away from people, noise, and the constant ringing of my phone. The idea of being somewhere completely cut off, no neighbors, no cell service, no traffic, sounded peaceful. I didn't know how wrong I was. The road leading up to the cabin was barely a road at all, just a narrow stretch of dirt and gravel that twisted through tall pine trees and dense brush. My truck struggled on the steep hills, the tires slipping on loose stones. It took almost an hour of slow, careful driving before I reached the place. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by trees that looked like they hadn't been trimmed or touched in years. The roof was slightly sagged, and the wood looked dry and gray from years of harsh winters. There was an old metal mailbox leaning sideways near the entrance, with no name on it. The air was colder than I expected, sharp with the smell of pine and damp earth. Inside, the cabin was small but decent enough for what I needed. A wood stove stood in the corner, An old table with a single chair sat by the window, and a narrow bed with a thin mattress was tucked in the back. There was no electricity, only a couple of kerosene lamps and a pile of split firewood stacked near the door. The silence was heavy, the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own breathing. I unpacked my bag, fed a few logs into the stove, and sat by the window watching the light fade. The only movement came from the trees swaying slightly in the wind. That first night went quietly. I slept early, wrapped in a thick blanket, and woke up just after sunrise. The mornings there had a stillness I'd never felt before. I made coffee on the small camping stove I'd brought, then decided to explore the woods a bit. I found a faint trail behind the cabin that led down toward what looked like an old logging area. Along the path, there were rusted cans, a few rotted planks, and a broken-down shed half covered by moss. It looked like no one had used the place in decades. I didn't think much of it then. It was just another sign of how forgotten this place was. By the second night, though, I started feeling something strange. I couldn't put a clear reason to it, but the atmosphere felt off. When I stepped outside to bring in more wood, I noticed faint footprints in the mud near the back of the cabin. They weren't mine. I'd only walked the front side earlier that day. They were spaced irregularly, like someone had been dragging their foot a little. The ground was soft from light rain, so they were fresh, maybe just a few hours old. I tried to convince myself they were old marks from the person who owned the place or maybe an animal. Still, they looked human. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing small noises outside, the crunch of leaves, the faint snap of a twig. I told myself it was probably deer or maybe raccoons, but I found myself sitting up several times, staring through the window into the dark. Every sound felt too close, like it was just beyond the wall. I eventually dozed off sometime after midnight. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach tighten. Near the side of the cabin, under one of the small windows, there were marks on the wall, 3 deep scratches cut into the wood. They weren't made by an animal, not with how straight they were. They looked like they'd been carved with a knife or some kind of sharp tool. I felt an uneasy pressure in my chest. I checked around the cabin for anything missing or damaged, but everything seemed in place. Still, the air felt different that morning, thicker, like the woods were holding something back. I told myself I'd only stay one more night. The plan was to leave in the morning, head back to the main road, and find a motel before going home. That last night, I made sure the door was locked, and I stacked the wood against it just in case. I kept my flashlight beside me and stayed close to the stove for warmth. Around 10 p.m., while I was sitting at the table writing in my notebook, I heard something that made me freeze completely. It was the slow, deliberate creak of the porch boards outside. Not wind, not an animal. It was a person's weight shifting on the steps. Then silence. I held my breath and listened so hard it made my ears ring. The cabin was so small that any movement outside sounded close. After maybe a full minute, I heard another sound. A faint scraping, like something metal brushing the door handle. My throat went dry. I didn't move. My flashlight was off, and the firelight flickered just enough to cast shadows across the room. The sound stopped, then started again, softer this time. I felt the floor vibrate under the faint weight of someone moving along the porch. It went on for several seconds, then silence again. I sat there in the dark, listening, barely blinking. An hour passed, maybe more. I didn't dare move or make noise. My heart was pounding hard enough I could feel it in my fingertips. When I finally gathered the nerve to stand and check through the window, there was nothing. Just darkness, trees, and fog creeping low over the ground. But near the edge of the porch, I saw something that hadn't been there before. It looked like a piece of torn fabric, hanging from one of the porch nails. I stared at it for a while, not wanting to step outside, not even to grab my gear. I stayed awake the rest of the night with the fire slowly dying down. When morning finally came, I stepped outside to leave. The air was damp, and everything looked washed in gray light. The piece of fabric was still there. It was dark, maybe from a jacket or shirt. I didn't touch it. I checked around the cabin one last time and saw more footprints in the mud near the trees. They led from the woods toward the cabin, then stopped a few feet from the door. No tracks leading away. It looked like whoever made them had just stood there for a long time, staring at the cabin, then vanished into the darkness. I didn't even eat breakfast. I packed my bag, loaded the truck, and started driving back down the trail as fast as the dirt road allowed. The entire time, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me. But there was nothing. When I finally reached the main road, I stopped and looked back one last time. The cabin was barely visible through the trees, but I could still see its roofline, sitting there in silence. Later that day, when I stopped at a small gas station outside of Great Falls, I mentioned to the clerk that I'd stayed in a cabin off the old logging road near the northern ridge. He looked at me strangely, then said that no one had owned or rented a cabin up there in years. The land had been abandoned after a fire decades ago. He said a few hunters still went near it, but most stayed away after a man went missing there the previous fall. They'd found his truck, but never him. I didn't say much else. I just nodded, filled my tank, and drove away. I've never gone back to Montana since then. But sometimes, when I think about those footprints that stopped right before the door, I still wonder if someone had been living out there all along. Someone who didn't want to be found. And maybe that night, when I heard the porch boards creak, they weren't trying to get in. Maybe they were just standing there, watching me through the cracks, waiting to see if I'd stay another night. It was late October, 2013, and I was working as a park ranger in the northern part of Montana, near the edge of Flathead National Forest. The area was a mix of steep ridges, pine forests, and long stretches of cold, open land. The kind of place where a storm could roll in without warning and the silence could make you feel like you were the last person on Earth. I had been stationed at a small ranger cabin about 14 miles from the main office, just a single-room structure made of old wood, with a tin roof that whined when the wind pushed through the trees. I had been there for almost 6 weeks, doing solo patrols and checking weather instruments. The park went quiet that time of year. Most of the tourists were gone, and even the hunters had mostly moved farther south. It was just me, the cabin, and a long dirt road that curved through the forest before disappearing into the hills. That week, the weather had been getting worse every day. The clouds hung low and heavy, and the air smelled like snow. During the mornings, frost clung to the porch steps, and by night the cold sank so deep it felt like it was seeping through my skin. I had a propane heater inside the cabin, but it barely made a difference once the wind picked up. Nights dragged on for hours, and I'd sometimes just sit at the small wooden table, listening to the wind slide across the roof and the faint creak of the trees outside. On the evening it happened, I'd finished checking a line of old bear traps left near the river. They weren't used anymore, but part of my job was to make sure no animals got stuck in them by accident. I remember the air being still, unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that made every step sound louder than it should. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the sky had turned a deep gray, and a drizzle started coming down, light at first but steady. I locked up the shed, took off my wet boots, and lit the small propane lantern inside. The light flickered against the log walls, and the shadows shifted across the floor. I made some instant coffee, sat near the heater, and tried to read, but something felt off. There was this strange tension in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. I could hear the rain tapping against the windows, then a faint metallic sound from outside. It wasn't loud, just enough to catch my attention. I brushed it off as wind, maybe a loose latch on the shed. But the sound came again, sharper this time. A light, irregular tapping, like something was brushing against the side of the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The rain had turned into a steady pour by then, and the beam of light from the flashlight cut through the misty air in a narrow line. I walked around the cabin slowly, the wet ground soft beneath my boots. Near the back wall, I found a set of prints in the mud. They weren't from boots, bare feet, small, maybe the size of a child's, but the shape wasn't right. The toes were spread far apart, and the steps were uneven, like whoever made them had been dragging one foot. They led out toward the treeline and disappeared into the darkness. For a moment, I just stood there, listening. All I could hear was rain hitting the leaves and my own breathing. I followed the prints for a few steps, shining the light into the trees, but the beam caught only wet bark and mist. My stomach tightened. There weren't supposed to be any people out there. No campsites, no trails, nothing. I backed up to the cabin and went inside, locking the door behind me. The prints bothered me, though. They were too fresh to ignore, and the idea of someone wandering around barefoot in that kind of weather didn't make sense. I sat back down, listening for any sound outside, but after a while, it all went quiet again. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a noise, something heavy falling against the cabin wall. I sat up fast, my heart racing. The lantern was still burning low, casting a dull orange glow across the room. I waited, holding my breath. Then came another sound, a scraping noise, slow and deliberate, like something was being dragged along the outer wall. I stood up and went for my rifle. It wasn't loaded, but the weight of it made me feel less exposed. I moved to the window, pulled back the curtain just a bit, and looked out. Through the rain-streaked glass, I saw movement near the shed. A shadow, faint, then gone again. It looked like someone had been standing there, just at the edge of the light. I turned down the lantern so I wouldn't be a clear target from outside. My pulse was hammering. The rain kept falling, masking smaller sounds, which made it worse. Every few minutes, I thought I heard soft footsteps or a light knock, but I couldn't tell what was real and what was my imagination. By 2 a.m, I'd had enough. I put on my jacket, slipped the rifle strap over my shoulder, and stepped outside again. The rain had eased a little, just a fine mist now. My flashlight beam moved across the clearing, and that's when I saw something that stopped me cold. Near the shed, the ground was disturbed, like something had been dragged from the trees. The mud was turned up, and there were long streaks leading toward the cabin, ending just a few feet from the back steps. I crouched down to look closer. Mixed in with the mud were what looked like small, pale shreds of fabric. A few inches long, torn, and soaked through. They looked like pieces of an old shirt. The wind shifted, and I caught the faint smell of something foul. Decay, like an animal that had died nearby. I followed the smell toward the treeline, and there, about 20 feet in, I found a shallow depression in the ground. It wasn't a hole exactly, more like something had been sleeping there or hiding. The earth was pressed down in a rough oval, and scattered around were scraps of cloth, broken twigs, and bones. Animal bones, I thought at first, but then I saw a piece that wasn't. A small, thin hand bone. Human. I froze. My flashlight trembled in my hand. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. My brain refused to make sense of it. When I finally forced myself to back away, I slipped in the mud and nearly dropped the light. The beam swung across the trees, and I caught another glimpse of movement. A figure this time, low to the ground, crouched near a stump. Then it bolted. Fast. Too fast. I didn't even chase it. I just turned and ran back to the cabin, slammed the door, and locked it twice. The rest of the night, I stayed sitting by the table, the rifle across my lap. I didn't sleep. I didn't even blink much. I just listened. Every now and then I heard faint noises from the woods. Snapping twigs, soft steps. But they never came close again. When dawn finally came, I stepped outside. The rain had stopped, and the fog had settled low across the clearing. The footprints were mostly washed away, but the disturbed earth near the trees was still there. I radioed the main office and told them there'd been signs of trespassing. I didn't mention what I'd actually seen. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding insane. Later that day, a search team came out. They found the depression in the ground, but no bones, no fabric, nothing. The place looked almost clean, like someone had swept it overnight. They told me it was probably an animal den, and maybe I'd mistaken the bones for something else in the dark. A few days later, I was reassigned to a different post closer to the main station. I didn't argue. When I packed up my things from the cabin, I noticed something that made my stomach twist again. On the outside wall, near the back corner, were 5 shallow scratches, side by side, dug deep into the wood, too wide apart to be human fingers. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. Every time I smell wet pine or hear rain on a tin roof, it comes back to me. I tell myself it was an animal, maybe a bear or something half-starved that had wandered too close. But the footprints, the fabric, those bones, they don't fit any simple answer. I've stopped trying to find one. I just know that in that forest, on that night, something was watching me. And whatever it wasn't afraid of the dark. It had been almost 6 years since I last drove that long, cracked road that led out past the river bend, through the birch woods, and into the hills where my ex-husband's cabin stood. I hadn't planned to ever see it again. The divorce had been final for years, and with it, I had cut off nearly every thread that tied me to that time in my life. But one quiet evening in late October, I got a call from a mutual friend saying the land was finally being sold off, and that if I wanted anything from the cabin, I should get it before it was cleared out. I didn't even think I cared about anything left there, but something inside me told me to go, maybe just to face what was left. It was raining lightly when I started out that morning, a thin mist clinging to the fields outside of Ashford, Vermont. The air smelled of wet leaves and cold pine, that sharp smell that always means winter is coming soon. The drive was longer than I remembered, the road more worn, lined with branches that had crept in from years of neglect. The tires hissed over puddles, and my old truck rattled like it was holding itself together out of habit. The closer I got, the quieter it became. Even the radio lost its signal, leaving only the sound of the rain tapping against the windshield. The cabin sat a few miles off the main dirt road, hidden behind a stretch of thick forest. I turned down the narrow track that led to it, barely visible under fallen leaves and mud. The trees leaned in on both sides, heavy with rain, their trunks dark and dripping. The path curved sharply downhill, then opened up to the clearing where the cabin stood. It looked smaller than I remembered, squatting low to the ground with its roof sagging slightly and the porch steps crooked. The dark green paint was flaking away, revealing the dull brown underneath. The windows were fogged, streaked with dirt. There was still the old rusted pickup parked to the side, his truck, where it had probably sat since he passed. I parked beside it and stepped out. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the air was cold enough that I could see my breath. The ground was soft, and my boots sank slightly as I walked toward the porch. Every step made a low crunch under the wet leaves. The cabin door was unlocked. I pushed it open, and the smell hit me first. Old wood, damp fabric, a faint trace of something metallic underneath it all, like rust. Inside, it looked almost exactly the same as the day I left. The same rough wooden furniture, the same worn-out rug by the fireplace, the same shelves lined with tools, jars, and forgotten things. But everything had aged. The air felt heavier, the wood darker. The silence was deep, thick, the kind of silence that made you aware of every small sound your body made. I stood in the doorway for a while, just looking around. The memories were strong, almost physical. I remembered the fights, the quiet mornings, the way the light used to come in through the back window when he made coffee. The cabin had once felt alive with our presence. Now it was just still and cold. I went through the main room first, checking drawers and cabinets, not really sure what I was looking for. Most of it was junk, old receipts, fishing lures, empty bottles. There was a half-empty box of nails on the table, a few tools scattered around like someone had left in a hurry. I went into the small bedroom next. The bed frame was still there, stripped bare except for the old mattress, stained and sunken in the middle. The closet door was open, and the smell of dust and rot came out in a thick wave. In one of the boxes near the dresser, I found a few of my old things. A flannel shirt I'd once worn out here, a small photo album with water damage along the edges. I flipped through it slowly. The photos were faded, our faces smiling in front of the lake, the cabin behind us, our dog running through the grass. It all felt like it belonged to a different person, someone I couldn't recognize anymore. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, just listening to the sound of the rain against the roof. It started to pick up again, heavier now, a steady drumming that echoed through the cabin. The windows rattled faintly. I could hear water dripping somewhere inside, maybe from the ceiling. When I finally stood up, I decided to check the back shed. It was where he used to keep the tools and hunting gear. I hadn't been in there since the last time I saw him. The shed was a few yards behind the cabin, half hidden by weeds and tall grass. I stepped carefully through the mud, holding my jacket tight against the wind. The door to the shed was swollen from moisture, and it took some force to push it open. Inside was dark, the air thick and stale. My flashlight beam caught the edges of metal shelves and old boxes stacked high. Everything was coated in a thin layer of dust. The smell was stronger here, mold, oil, and something sour. A few dead mice lay near the back corner. I could see his old workbench with tools still neatly arranged, just like he used to keep them. On the far side, something caught my eye, an old tarp covering a large shape. I hesitated, then pulled it back. Underneath was a rusted metal drum, sealed shut with a heavy lid. There were stains running down the sides, dark and old. I didn't know why, but my stomach tightened. I stepped closer, shining the light over it. There were scuff marks on the floor around it, as if it had been moved or dragged. I thought about leaving right then, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a crowbar from the workbench and pried the lid open. It took effort, but the seal finally cracked with a loud metallic snap. A wave of smell came out, strong, foul, like rot and chemicals. I gagged and stepped back, covering my mouth. Inside the drum were what looked like scraps of fabric and something unrecognizable underneath. It took a few seconds before my brain understood what I was seeing. Pieces of clothing, bits of rope, and something pale, bone-like, mixed in with dirt and hardened residue. My hands went cold instantly. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. It wasn't fresh. Whatever had been there for years. I stared at it for what felt like forever, my mind trying to make sense of it. He'd told me once, years ago, about a hiker who'd gone missing near the property. They searched the woods for weeks and never found him. I remember him saying it must have been a bear or that the man had wandered too far north. I never questioned it. I backed out of the shed, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it shook my ribs. I left the door open, not wanting to touch anything else. The rain was falling harder now, turning the ground into a slick mess. I ran back to the cabin, grabbed the photo album and my jacket, and left everything else. The drive back felt like it took hours. My hands were shaking on the wheel the whole time. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that metal drum, those shapes inside. When I finally got back into town, I parked near the diner and sat there for a long time, trying to slow my breathing. I didn't call anyone at first. I didn't even know what I'd say. Later that night, I called the police. I told them where the cabin was, what I found, and left my name. They asked if I wanted to come in for questions, but I said I'd talk in the morning. I couldn't go back there again. 2 days later, they called to confirm it. The remains in the drum belonged to a man who went missing in 2016, about a year before my ex-husband died. They said they'd found more evidence buried near the shed, things he'd likely kept hidden for years. I didn't ask for details. I didn't want them. Now, when I think about that cabin, it's not the fights or the silence I remember. It's that feeling in the shed, that smell, the realization that I'd lived beside someone who carried a secret that deep. The land got sold, and the cabin was torn down soon after. Sometimes I drive past that road on the way to the lake, and I look toward the trees where it used to stand. Nothing's there now but grass and a few scattered stones. But even from the road, I can still picture it. The crooked porch, the sagging roof, the cold, still air inside. And I know I'll never go back.